Hello everyone, welcome to the recorded video presentation about utilitarianism, as discussed by John Stuart Mill. First things first, before we begin, as you watch this video, we want you to imagine being put in the trolley story. What is a trolley story? Well, some of you might be familiar with it, but for some that aren't, it's basically the story between choosing to save one life or a family. Say, an unstoppable train is coming and the train track can be switched either to the right or to the left. Up ahead, the left track is a man tied up. On the other hand, the right track has a tied family. What will you choose? Imagine again, you are Batman and you have the chance to kill the Joker. You, as Batman, swear to never kill anyone, but you know killing the Joker would be saving the lives of tens, if not hundreds of people that the villain has yet to terrorize. What is moral and what is not in these situations? Saving the life of one or saving the life of many? Are you morally right for not resorting to violence even though catastrophic damage was done? Or are you morally right if you choose to kill so long as you prevented a tragedy? That is what we will find out with utilitarianism. Who exactly proposed utilitarianism? Perhaps its most credited founder is Jeremy Bentham, but another one to note is John Stuart Mill. So let's get to know him. The author of the book, Utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, was born on May 20, 1806, and lived up until 1873. Being born in the 19th century, he was known as a prominent English philosopher, an economist, a political thinker, and one of the most influential figures in the history of ethics and philosophy. He was one of the exponents of the moral thinking called utilitarianism. So, what exactly is it? What is utilitarianism? Well, it's a moral theory that suggests that we should aim to maximize overall happiness and minimize suffering in our actions and decisions. In essence, it's about promoting the greatest good for the greatest number of people. John Stuart Mill developed utilitarianism was influenced by the historical context of his time, which was the 19th century. Several key historical and intellectual factors played a role in shaping Mill's version of utilitarianism. First, Enlightenment and classical utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is a moral and political philosophy, and it had its root in the Enlightenment era of the 18th century. Thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, a contemporary of Mill's father, James Mill, laid the groundwork for utilitarianism. Classical utilitarianism, as articulated by Bentham, emphasized the principle of the greatest happiness for the greatest number. As the foundation of morality and public policy, Mill was deeply influenced by Bentham ideas, but sought to refine and expand upon them. Industrial revolution was also a factor. The 19th century was a period of profound social and economic change, marked by the Industrial Revolution. The rapid industrialization and urbanization of society led to new challenges and ethical questions regarding labor conditions, wealth distribution, and the overall well-being of society. Mill's utilitarianism aimed to address these issues by providing a framework for evaluating policies and actions based on their consequences for human happiness and welfare. Another factor is the moral and political reform. Mill lived during a time of significant social and political reform movements, including the push for women's rights, workers' rights, and for various other social justice issues. Mill was an advocate for these causes and used utilitarianism to argue for greater individual freedom, equal rights, and social progress. His essay on liberty, published on 1859, is a notable work in the regard, emphasizing the importance of individual autonomy and the harm principle in limiting the power of the state. We also have philosophical developments. Mill was also influenced by the philosophical developments of his time, including the works of German idealists like Immanuel Kant and British philosophers like John Locke and David Hume. Mill sought to reconcile utilitarianism with deontological ethics and individual rights, which contributed to the distinctive features of his version of utilitarianism. Political and social turbulence. The 19th century was marked by significant political and social turbulence, including revolutions, uprising, and the spread of democracy. Mill's utilitarianism provides a philosophical basis for evaluating and justifying political and social institutions in a changing world. Now, there's another influence to Mill's work, which we actually have mentioned, and the previous group has mentioned, which is Jeremy Bentham. As mentioned, he was a contemporary of John Mill's father, and he was one of the exponents of utilitarianism. But what exactly is the difference between Bentham's version and Mill's version? As both influential philosophers associated with utilitarianism, their versions of the model moral thinking have some important differences. Bentham was considered a quantitative hedonist. He focuses on maximizing the quantity of pleasure and minimizing the quantity of pain. On the other hand, Mill was a qualitative hedonist. He introduced the concept of qualitative hedonism, arguing that not all pleasures are of equal quality. He maintained that higher intellectual and moral pleasures have greater value than lower physical pleasures. Mill's utilitarianism emphasizes the quality of pleasure and considers the qualitative differences in happiness. We will be discussing that further as we go along. Now, what actually makes utilitarianism different from other moral theories? Well, it focuses more on consequences than the intent. In other words, it focuses on the results of the action and treats intention as irrelevant. In a way, it is hedonistic, as it means that whatever is pleasant, therefore means good. But don't get confused. It might sound egoist or selfish, but in fact, it is actually other regarding. It aims to pursue happiness not just for ourselves, but for as many sentient beings as possible. So, what exactly drives our morality? Happiness is what drives our morality, according to John Stuart Mill. For example, let's say you have the choice between eating a piece of cake or going for a run. Utilitarian would argue that you should choose the option that produces the most pleasure and the least pain. Hence, the morality of an action is determined by its consequence, specifically the amount of pleasure and pain that it produces. The book had five chapters in which Mill discusses the concept of utilitarianism. In the first chapter, he defined it. He began by defining the principle of utilitarianism as the greatest happiness principle. It states that actions are right to the extent that they promote happiness or pleasure, and wrong to the extent that they produce suffering or pain. In essence, the morality of an action is determined by its consequences in terms of overall well being. The second chapter, titled What is Utilitarianism? In this chapter, Mill further explores the concept of utilitarianism, clarifying its principles and addressing common misconceptions such as the swine criticism, which we will get onto later. The third chapter was titled Of the Ultimate Sanction of the Principle of Utility. Mill explores the concept of the ultimate justification or sanction for the principle of utility, which underlies utilitarianism. He examines why individuals should follow the utilitarian principle and act in ways that maximize overall happiness. Second to the last chapter, titled Of What Sort of Proof the Principle of Utility is Susceptible. In this chapter, Mill delves into the question of how we can establish and justify the principles of utility at the foundation of morality. He also introduces the concept of qualitative hedonism to explain the quantitative differences in pleasure. He explores various forms of evidence and proof that can be offered to support utilitarianism. The last chapter, which is titled On the Connect between Justice and Utility. In this chapter, Mill explores the relationship between the principles of justice and utility within the framework of utilitarianism. He addresses the question about the moral basis of justice and its connection to maximizing overall happiness. Is there a hierarchy of pleasure? Surely not anything that is good would be prioritized. Well, yes. Mill believed that there are higher and lower pleasure, which will be explained by my partner, Gilean. Okay.
There's two things that make pleasure a higher one, and that is if a choice is given if it would be chosen over another pleasure, even if it was accompanied by discomfort, or if it would not be traded with a higher quantity of another pleasure. Another point Mill pointed out in how there are levels of happiness is when he stated it is better to be human dissatisfied than a pig dissatisfied, or than a pig satisfied. He, and I quote, said, few human creatures would consent to be changed into any of the lower animals for promise of the fullest allowance of a beast's pleasures. No intelligent human being would consent to be a fool. No instructed person would be an ignoramus. Further down the reading, Mill brought up ultimate sanction. What is it? It is the basis for adhering to the principle of utility, which is maximizing happiness. He argues that the moral obligation to promote happiness is derived from our innate desire for it, or in other words, innate desire for happiness serves as the basis for moral duty. Since at the end of the day, humans do want to be happy. That is the end goal for the most of us. Now, of course, it is not perfect by any means. It was criticized by a lot of peers and for a reason. People argued that he likened humans to that of a swine who lives their life in constant pursuit of pleasure, be it through eating, sleeping, and the like. It takes the utilitarian doctrine to be unfit for humans because it recognizes no higher purpose to life than the mere pursuit of pleasure. He refuted it by saying, as mentioned before, that there are levels in pleasure, like intellectual and spiritual happiness being a level above the happiness that of a swine. So, how could it be used? It can be used for rules and guideline making. Now, for example, if a company is deciding whether or not to lay off employees to increase profits, the greatest happiness principle would dictate that the company should consider the impact on the community and society as a whole. If laying off employees would cause significant harm and reduce overall happiness, then the decision would not be morally justifiable according to utilitarianism. There's another example of the surgeon, wherein he is to operate on five people who needs a heart, a lung, kidney, and other body part, and there's no source for it. The doctor just happens to have a good for nothing neighbor who he's pretty sure no one would care if he's gone. So the moral dilemma here is should he take the neighbor to save five people? This is where the act or classical utilitarianism and rule utilitarianism needs to be distinguished. The act utilitarian considers only the results or consequences of the single act, while the rule utilitarian considers the consequences that result of following a rule of conduct. As it as its name implies, we ought to live by rules that, in general, are likely to produce the greatest good for the greatest number. What are the challenges of utilitarianism? It is difficult to determine what exactly is higher or lower pleasure, and to calculate and compare happiness. There's also the possibility of morally questionable consequences. Now let's run through the key points discussed. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that suggests we should aim to maximize overall happiness and minimize suffering in our actions and decisions. It's about promoting the greatest good for the greatest number of people. Pleasure can either be categorized as higher and lower pleasure. So, to sum it up, utilitarianism is a moral theory that evaluates the morality of deeds based on their capacity to increase overall happiness or decrease suffering. While it offers simplicity and a focus on results, it has issues with respect for individual rights. Now, happiness is measured at potential moral conundrums. Although it is still a well known ethical system, Utilitarianism needs to be balanced and implemented with caution. And lastly, there are a lot of applications for utilitarianism, and even in daily life, you might be subjecting yourself in it. That is all. Thank you.